Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this Education Writers Association webinar, which is titled Teacher Prep Interrupted, Licensing Educators During Coronavirus. My name is Stacia Cedillo, and I'm a program specialist here at EWA. Before we begin, I'm going to go over some housekeeping items. So the first is questions. If you have a question for our speakers, you can type those into the question box that is located in the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. When you ask a question, please include your name and affiliation. We will get to those questions throughout the webinar, and we'll also have a designated Q&A portion of the webinar at the end of today's conversation. As the webinar closes, you are also going to get an evaluation survey. So please complete that survey. We do read all of your comments and take your feedback very seriously. So we ask that you complete that once the webinar is over. So let's get started. Let me introduce today's panelists. Today we're joined by Peter Fishman, who is a Vice President at Deans for Impact, Vice President of Strategy. Lynn Gangone, who is CEO and President of the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. And today's moderator is Bracy Harris, who is a staff writer at the Hechinger Report. So I'm going to hand it over to our moderator. Bracy, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thanks, Stacia. Well, I'm really excited about this afternoon's conversation. I've always found the topic of teacher licensure really fascinating, and I want to assure you, all of those of you out there, if you haven't written about it before, or you think it's too wonky or in the weeds, or your readers wouldn't be interested, there's totally a way that you can dig into this, and parents and caregivers are definitely going to care. So with that being said, let's just jump straight into this issue. I'll give some background first in case we have some folks that are new to the beat starting out on that are on this call. Just kind of in a nutshell, when we're talking about teacher licensure, we're looking at what states say needs to be in place before an educator is in the classroom and instructing children. That's like the most basic way to think of it. And so now we're going to dig in, and Peter, we'll start with you getting sort of an overview of the work that you do with Deans for Impact.
Great, thanks, Bracy, and good afternoon, everyone. Peter Fishman, I'm the Vice President of Strategy with Deans for Impact. We're a national nonprofit organization with a mission of ensuring that every child is taught by well-prepared teachers. And the work we do is in support right now of about 60 educator preparation programs across the country that collectively prepare about 12,000 new teachers a year across 30 states and DC. So the support is deep rather than broad. We do intensive leadership development support and work directly with teams of faculty, teacher educators, school partners to redesign coursework, clinical experiences, assessment, all grounded in insights from cognitive science. I know in a moment, Lynn's going to speak to some of the broad themes across the broad membership of AACTE. I'll share just sort of 3 thoughts about things that we're hearing from programs that we work with this spring. The first, and I guess this is sort of the like John Krasinski, some good news like portion of this hour, is that we're hearing a lot of really hopeful and positive stories of future teachers who have pivoted to remote learning spaces. They're delivering meals and paper-based packets to students at home. They're recording lessons that are broadcast on local television. And maybe counterintuitively, another thing that we're hearing is that a lot of teachers that are enrolled this spring or completing programs this spring, they may emerge with their programs with a deeper appreciation of out-of-school factors that influence learning, a deeper appreciation of family and home life, and deeper understanding around student thinking and the contextual factors that influence student thinking. And don't want to sort of overly romanticize this moment because it is so incredibly challenging and painful across so many different dimensions of our national life and our individual lives. But there may be, I think there are some silver linings that might emerge that are really good for future teachers. Second sort of thought is, and this is sort of shifting away from some good news, is as in K-12, the shift to remote learning in teacher education has the potential to exacerbate inequities that exist within teacher ed. There are many, I'll name just one obvious one, which is that with the shift to virtual clinical experiences, one of the things that we're seeing and hearing is future teachers this spring who maybe were in a student teaching placement or in a field experience and had to shift quickly to find maybe another placement with a school or school system or in a classroom that was doing remote learning in some sort of robust way, that we know from other reporting that was largely happening this spring disproportionately in schools and communities, classrooms, with kids who are already economically advantaged or advantaged by the education system. And if that's where more clinical placements are occurring, that has implications for the types of experiences and the types of students that our future teachers are working with in preparation. So something for programs and states really be paying a lot of attention to as we move into next school year, because we think, at least at Deans for Impact, that a lot of clinical experiences will continue to be virtual, continue to be online come the fall and all of next school year. The third thing, and this is to point to a specific resource, we're also hearing that states are really feeling their way through, as we all are in our national life. And one thing that we started hearing in late March from the programs that we work with is that there's a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty about policy shifts governing licensure, entry and exit requirements, clinical experiences, and programs and future teachers simply wanted to know what those policy shifts were. They weren't being communicated terribly well. So late March, we started to put together a database that became a 50-state tracker that's now publicly available on our website. I think I can share the link here in the chat box. If you go to the link that's in the chat box, there's a link there to a 50-state tracker. It's a spreadsheet of changes across different dimensions of teacher licensure. In the left-hand column of the tracker, each of the state names has a hyperlink that takes you to another page with links to the direct guidance provided from states. Sometimes, most of the time, that's publicly available. Sometimes it's information that has been shared with programs via email and then subsequently shared with us, and it's up there in the link. A lot of information here. We intentionally did it as a spreadsheet that could be downloaded with filters that folks can manipulate and do their own exploration, and we've been updating it on a roughly once a week basis. A lot here to digest, and I know we'll have a chance to talk through different aspects of the policy environment in the course of this hour. So thanks.
Great, and now we're going to hear from Lynn, and I can tell you that ACTE is one of the acronyms as an education reporter that you should definitely add into your work bank.
Bracy, thank you for that. I appreciate the opportunity to be with EWA today, and again, hello to everyone. Yes, Deans for Impact is a colleague organization, and they've done some really great work intensively with the 60 institutions, as Peter mentioned. ACTE is actually a membership association that represents around 750 colleges, universities, and programs of teacher education around the country. And you know, we have had a long history of representing our members. I was saying to Bracy before everyone came on that we're moving into new spaces in terms of a significant commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. That includes a program that I would love all of you to write about at some point, which is our Home Scholars Program, which is a program that's specific to bringing in underrepresented individuals into both the professoriate of our colleges and universities, as well as across the board in ed policy. So these are students of color who self-identify as such, and we have a terrific program and many success stories. So would love to share that with you at some point. We also do a lot of work with looking at where teachers are, what's coming up through the pipeline. We work also on looking at teacher leadership and school leadership, right? How do we create opportunities for teachers and principals to work together? It takes everyone, and so we're certainly engaged in that work. We also facilitate a ton of collaborations nationally on behalf of our members and the field. And as I was telling Bracy earlier, we've done a number of research briefs that actually you can access from our webpage, and again, from a reporting perspective, you would probably like to look at those. They're very succinct. They're based on publicly available data, but looking at things like how financial aid is distributed across education majors. Are there differences based on race? What can we learn in terms of recommendations to institutions to assist with helping those students move up and through the pipeline? We're going to talk more about that in a bit. But I want to sort of piggyback on what Peter said about some good news. I hope some of you have seen that. I'm an addict. I think John Brzezinski is doing a great job. And one of the things he's talked about is how we should be paying teachers millions and millions of dollars to teach, because what is being realized by everyone is that teaching is not just something everyone can do. And so one of the things that I think that's important right now is that we're really busting the myth, right, around what it means to be a teacher. You know, teachers are not just born, teachers are actually made, and they're made through very rigorous preparation, looking at how they manage both pedagogy and the social and emotional needs of students. We have some of our institutions right now who are even saying we can't rely on just one teacher in the classroom. We have to look at teams that go into school districts and really create the opportunity to look at the system differently. And if there's anything I want to talk about today, it's both the individual teacher and the system. I think this is an opportunity for us through the disruption that's occurred to really look at the system. Let's look at, you know, equity indexes around school funding. Let's look at what's really happening to our candidates of color. I think this is an opportunity. So again, not to diminish the pain, you know, tonight in Colorado where I live, we're going to have a quiet moment and a statewide tribute to those who have died from COVID-19. So there's nothing about this that should be celebrated. However, it is an opportunity for us to think differently about how we educate all of our students. So I'll close with that and then say that we too have a state policy tracker. It's a little bit different than Peter's. We can actually show you, we can do a screen share and show you what we've done. It is publicly available with some of the same information that Peter has shared, but it gives you a chance to interact with a map that shows you what each of the states have done, and again, links you to that guidance that each state has. So we have this COVID-19 resource page, which you're welcome to peruse at your leisure, but we can click on the state policy tracking map right now and show you a few of the features so that you get a sense of what we're looking at. And we are updating this probably daily at this point, given, you know, we have some states that still haven't reported out. So you can see on the screen where the states have not reported, states that have reported. And then you can see what's happening with initial licensure, clinical preparation, hiring and induction practices. And you can see there, if you dig down into, for example, Indiana, what they've been doing. And then you have a link right to the Indiana Department of Education for what their latest guidance is. So this is designed to help all of you and to help the field to remain current on what is happening in terms of licensure and certification. And Bracey's absolutely right. You don't have to be a policy wonk to be interested in this. It's important work.
Okay, so moving into our sort of question and discussion period, I'd like to hear from you both sort of, you know, normally the sort of track that individuals take to become certified to become a teacher. They usually enter into an educator prep program, and that can have its own entrance requirements that, depending on a candidate's background and K-12 educational experiences, might be a little bit of a barrier to then you're moving into doing your coursework, and then of course to be sort of exit requirements, student teaching, and then finally a number of states have licensure exams. So just as I laid out there, there's a lot of puzzle pieces that are in play before someone becomes certified to be a teacher, and we see that a lot of those requirements are sort of in flux now. So you both have been monitoring what's going on. Are there any sort of significant changes or swings in how states have gone about this process that stick out to you?
Yeah, I would say I mean, Peter would, I'm sure, agree with this. There's swings all over the place. It just depends on the state that you speak to. And some real challenges that are out there in terms of states that have gone ahead and maybe extended the timeline for teacher certification, states that have dropped that requirement completely. You know, we're also concerned about what's going to happen in the fall. We have one of our deans has told us that his state is not going to allow teacher candidates into schools in the fall. So it's an ever-changing landscape, and I'm sure Peter has some things to say about that as well.
Yeah, it's changing a lot, and it varies tremendously. I mean, literally all over the map. I think I saw a headline in Ed Week today around K-12 policies being all over the map. It's the same thing in educator preparation, and I'd argue it's even more chaotic in terms of the changes from one state to another. You have everything from states that are simply saying 30, 60 days after the current state of emergency is up, then a future teacher would have to complete sort of all licensure requirements, mostly sort of exit assessments at that point, to state of Mississippi saying that all entry and exit assessments for teachers into and out of programs related that are test-based are suspended through the end of 2021. So big ranges, and also big ranges in terms of the length of emergency licenses that are being issued right now. In most places, it's a 1-year emergency license. In some places, it's 3 years, 5 years. That's also varying a lot from state to state.
Okay. And speaking of Mississippi, which is where I'm based, something that I've found sort of fascinating around our state's response in terms of suspending entry requirements for teacher prep programs is prior to all of this occurring, it was very common to hear from folks that had dreams of becoming an educator, saying that they had been deterred because of those entry requirements. And now through, quite frankly, this crisis, we've seen some individuals sort of getting a second chance to pursue those dreams. So I'm interested in kind of what maybe this pandemic is revealing about pre-existing equity issues and the way that maybe educator prep programs design entry requirements or even exit requirements. Like, how is this bringing attention maybe to some of those barriers?
Yeah, that's a really great observation. And Mississippi has been really interesting in terms of how it's been looking at this, and also previous to this, its state teacher shortage. Right. And so, you know, there's a lot of conversation in the field about this, right? Both the entrance, which may be considered a barrier to some students, right? The exit, so we talk about praxis, ed TPA, those sorts of assessments. It's both an understanding of those assessments and what they provide, and also for many students, it's a cost issue, right? So many of our lower socioeconomic students can't afford those assessments. So now we have this opening, as you've illustrated. And so does it provide for opportunity? I think, does it provide for opportunity, and does it reduce quality, right? I mean, there are those two kind of conundrums, and I hate that they're always juxtaposed, because I think that's a bit of a false argument. So, you know, for example, right now with the suspension that you've talked about, you know, for us, it would be, how do we work with school districts? How do we have our ed prep programs working with school districts to make sure that an induction period is well managed, right? How do we make sure that, and this is all, I say this knowing that we don't know what's going to happen, right? Will there be the master teacher, for example, who will be able to then work with that candidate who perhaps hasn't had the opportunity to fully complete and be assessed? Right? How do we ensure that that candidate's ready, what we call classroom ready? So in theory, one of the things we could do would be to strengthen induction, to strengthen that opportunity for that teacher to be mentored. Can that happen right now? Will we be on ground? You know, will we be able to reduce class size enough for that to happen? I don't know, but that's certainly a strategy.
There's also, and for reporters that are covering sort of licensure and licensure tests perhaps for the first time, it's worth taking a look at the research base behind the praxis exams, the content exams in particular. There's not a strong research base showing that performance on those exams corresponds or relates to any kind of in-service indicators of teacher effectiveness or for retention in the profession, placement. There is indications that that they contain racial bias and that has a result on who enters the profession. If anything, the performance-based assessments, things like the EdTPA and some of the state-based performance assessments, have stronger relationships empirically between performance on those and how somebody does as a teacher of record and a number of different factors. And so there's an opportunity here, particularly if states and researchers working together build the data systems and document in such a way to look at, like in a place like Mississippi where the praxis has been suspended now, do future teachers who come in not having passed that, are their outcomes any different or as a result? And I suspect what we're going to find, but we won't know until we sort of look at it as empirically, is perhaps some of those gateways into the profession that we've typically had don't correspond as well. And there may be some gateways that exist that do. Mississippi, for instance, isn't waiving the GPA requirements for entry into profession. They are waiving the practice exam.
Hi, I just wanted to pop back in because we have a question on this topic about national standards for teacher certification. So Frank Lavoie asks, do you guys think that the pandemic will heighten awareness of and support for the need to have national standards for teacher certification?
I'm not sure about national standards. I think it's heightened the conversation around reciprocity and licensure reciprocity. A number of states that we've seen that have sort of have made it easier for out-of-state teachers now to come into the state and teach as a result, so greater reciprocity. But that's always been and will probably continue to be a sticking point. And whether we see greater reciprocity that persists beyond the emergency measures being put in place that are time bound, that expire after a particular time, I don't know. I'm curious, Lynn, your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, Peter. And I do know that, one of our strategic partners is an organization whose acronym is NASDAQ, the National Association of State Directors of Teacher Education Certification. And one of the things that they've been doing under the leadership of Dr. Phil Rogers, who's their executive director, is they've created they're working to create an interstate compact. And they're doing that right now in the New England states. And so it's definitely worth you following up on that. What they're trying to do is to create that kind of reciprocity that Peter just spoke of. And so they're looking at how do they manage, right, what their expectations are for teachers and their performance, quote unquote, and then how do they allow for all of the New England states to be able to take advantage of teacher candidates from any of those states to come in and be able to teach, as well as teachers who already are in the field and who may want to move around. It's an interesting study. We do have national standards. Interestingly, they exist. Not necessarily for certification per se, but we have a set of national standards that talk about what the expectations are for teachers based on National Board Certified Teachers. They're called NTACs. We have lots of acronyms in education, so I apologize. But again, what happens is each state takes those and they kind of play around with them in their own way, and so then it creates a diffusion rather than a unity. So I do think that what we're going to be looking at is the reciprocity piece and some interesting ways to get there.
Okay, and since we just talked about reciprocity, I'd like to visit another issue that often comes up with teachers too, and that's, of course, sometimes the certification that they receive, it's time limited. For instance, in Mississippi, teachers, once they have full certification, receive a 5-year standard license, and there's qualifications that they have to meet to get that renewed. So Peter, one question that I have is, are there some policy solutions that are being talked about or developed to sort of extend certifications for folks whose certifications might be lapsing soon?
Yeah. So a lot of states have put in place stipulations around licenses that will expire this year. In most cases, it's sort of 30, 60, 90 days after the state of emergency is lifted. You have that much time to get your license renewed. If you need to complete professional development for that, if you need to simply jump through the sort of bureaucratic hoops around that, you have that amount of time. I think the longest we've seen is the state of Connecticut is going to give a year window for people to renew a license that expires right now. The big question I have right now is whether states will move to allow individuals whose licenses have lapsed, say within the last 5 years, to come back into the profession. You know, I think we saw in medicine and medical treatment this spring that a lot of places had to rush to find nurses, doctors to be able to staff hospitals. And that meant finding people whose licenses had lapsed, sometimes retired, sometimes they had active licenses in other states and they were coming in. We have a chance in education to get out ahead of that heading into next fall. And any of the scenarios involving school reopening are going to require additional personnel and more creative sort of staffing and personnel. Now, budget's going to be the huge, question. Obviously, it's the, 2,000-pound gorilla in every room that isn't even really a gorilla because it's the thing that everyone is talking about. But any way of reopening school, whether it's through staggered schedules, hybrid configurations of learning, rolling closures, and then not to mention the additional social, emotional, mental health needs of students, the physical needs of students. All of these things require more personnel in schools come the fall, or require some kind of hybrid configuration with some people in person and some educators continuing to work remotely, leaving aside all of the teachers who may not want to or feel comfortable coming back because of their own health concerns. So all of that points to a need for more people. And I think that one thing that states could be doing right now is really looking at licenses that have lapsed and saying, hey, if you had some amount of time of teaching experience in our state prior to that, maybe you're a mother or a father who left the teaching profession in order to raise young kids, and your license lapsed as a result of that. This may be an opportunity to bring those people back into teaching because it will help to staff our schools and perhaps staff, remote learning spaces with professional educators who have experience, understand the standards, understand child development, and so on. We haven't seen many states that are moving in that direction yet, but I suspect there's going to be that type of movement in the next month or two.
It'll depend a lot too, as you pointed out, on whether or not we're able to return on ground, right, hybrid or online, and there's still so much that's up in the air on that. And it's interesting, Deans for Impact and AACTE actually talked a bit about whether or not we could pull together the EPP's educational prep programs around the country to actually support students in online learning through taking our most advanced teacher candidates and helping them coalesce into a tutoring force, a volunteer force, right? Taking advantage of teacher candidates who may not be able to be placed, et cetera. So I don't think that idea is dead, Peter. And I think that, we may still be able to do something with that depending on what we see school districts doing in the fall. But certainly if we have a lot of the districts remaining online, it's not just even about getting those certified teachers back into the classroom. We also have to worry about issues of equity and the continued exacerbation of inequities as we've seen with online learning, both predominantly for our lower socioeconomic students, our special education students, which is an area that we really haven't touched on. But again, this is very complicated, and depending on how districts choose to reopen, I use in quotes because they're open right now, it's just they're open virtually. So we'll see what happens.
And speaking of virtually, something that I think about is during summertime, sometimes when you have children in summer school or receiving remediation, that is also an opportunity for individuals that are in alternate route teacher prep programs to get in clinical experience. So, Lynn, what are some of the things that you've heard about educator prep programs and how they're looking to sort of handle teachers missing out on that, possibly, depending on what happens with this summer? I'm not an epidemiologist, but possibly missing out on that one-to-one FaceTime and in-person instruction with students.
Well, you know, what we're seeing actually, interestingly, is many of our institutions are reporting an uptick in enrollments for the summer. I'm not quite sure why that is, if there are just students who just want to complete. We're really concerned in higher education about the students who may not return, maybe our most vulnerable students. That's another conversation. But thinking about both the summer and beyond, and Peter, it wasn't lost on me that you talked about this a bit earlier in terms of schools with more privilege. But we are, you know, at this point offering through AACTE, I have a partnership with Immersion, and I'm not sure if this is where you're going, Gracie, but it's a virtual reality. It's a simulated environment where if teachers or teacher candidates can't get that one-on-one like this, relatively speaking, we're all on Zoom, so I mean, or GoToMeeting. So, but to give them an opportunity to learn and to have that experience. I don't know if we could pull up the Immersion site right now. That would be something I would love to just address very briefly. We're offering to our members the opportunity to, at a discount. So hopefully, Peter, that'll address some of the concerns about it being a very, you know, perceived to be an expensive tool, to our members to allow them to institute these virtual reality classrooms. Immersion is the only company that offers this. It's an incredible program. We have a number of our institutions, both large and small, using this. Some with really interestingly diverse student populations. So University of Texas, Rio Grande, which has a very large percentage of students of color. They are embedded in using Immersion, and both for their student teaching as well as clinical practice. And so, you know, that's one way that we're looking to create some innovation for our teacher candidates to get the kind of experience that they need in real time.
Okay. Also, something that I've thought about, like we've discussed, there have been some opportunities for innovation in this moment, but of course we also understand that our country and globally as well is very much going through a crisis. And something that I wonder about is when we're thinking of teacher candidates that maybe have missed out on student teaching because of this, or how we have universities kind of scrambling in response. I'm curious if any universities are maybe thinking about sort of trauma-informed curriculum for folks that are getting ready to go into the field and may very well be, you know, interacting with children that have been impacted by this, possibly through a family member being sick or even having passed, or economically with the jobs that have been lost and seeing a family member go through that.
I think it gets to a lot of needs there. One of them is around induction support for new teachers. And you think about somebody that's starting up next fall, it is going to be so challenging on every single teacher, every single educator working with students in the fall. But you think about a new teacher starting out, that's a tough, really, really tough time, even in the best of circumstances. And we think that additional supports need to be in place. Just saw the other day that state of Illinois has announced that part of their CARES funding for education is going to go to $6.5 million for virtual coaching for each of the 4,000 new teachers that they're projecting in the state next year. I think that that's a really smart move. I don't think they don't know yet what's the content of that virtual coaching, but you can imagine that the coaches are experienced educators with deep expertise or deep knowledge of working with students who've been impacted by trauma, also deeply understand instructional practice. And I think that's a really promising thing that we'd like to see other states doing heading into next year, and really thinking about what's the induction support that needs to be in place. How do you do probably what will have to be virtual coaching really well for those beginning teachers?
Yeah, absolutely well said, Peter. You know, the induction piece and what Illinois is doing with virtual coaching is I think really smart. You know, you asked about the trauma-informed instruction. We are seeing more of our prep programs incorporating that. I would also say what this pandemic has highlighted for us is also our capacity to create technological literacy among our teacher candidates and our teachers. We have been very much in a relationship, one-on-one, one-on however many, in a classroom. And, certainly the trauma-informed piece, what I've heard today, it was interesting. I was talking to another dean this morning, and and she was talking about what she's experiencing right now with her teacher candidates. So what she said was that, first of all, there are teacher candidates who already had some mental health issues themselves that are now exacerbated, and more having mental health issues in general, right? I mean, I think that what we know about our student population, both in K-12 and higher education, is that those social emotional needs are critical. This gets back to a bit of how we need to really think about starting to create teams rather than relying on one teacher to be technologically literate, to meet all the social and emotional needs, to be able to understand pedagogy, to be able to deliver content. We should be paying teachers millions of dollars because of the work that they do. And, for so many of our students right now, they're also in homes where they're not safe. And, so I just think of those kids who don't have a place to study, don't have a place to hook up to internet. I know one of my dear friends is president of one of the California state institutions that services a rural community, and they're working with their school districts to make sure that those K-12 students have access to a tower where they can get an internet signal so that they can actually do their online classes. The complexities of this and the social and emotional needs that are as a result are really enormous.
I think this is also, though, where state and state policy has a role to play. And I think as reporters asking your states what they're doing on this. So to give you an example, there are some states that are requiring the ed prep programs to basically report exactly what they're doing to modify the experience for beginning teachers. State of Rhode Island is asking programs to really clearly articulate how they're addressing equity. And what they mean by that is both equity around access to technology, but also equitable access to learning experiences for teacher candidates who may be in a category that's medically vulnerable, maybe have mental health challenges. And so programs actually have to address in their plans to modify the experience how they're taking into account issues of equity of access, issue of equity of medical condition too. And Rhode Island is one of the few states that we've seen actually make a move like that. And it's something that I think other states could do as they're thinking about both supporting their programs next year, but also holding their programs accountable that the modifications they make to the learning experience for future teachers, again, isn't exacerbating inequities, but in fact is addressing them.
Okay, and I wanted to end by asking you all, there's some changes that have happened through this that it's obvious they're temporary, like tweaks to grading policies, for examples. But when it comes to licensure, something that I've been thinking about lately is already on social media, we've heard from aspiring educators in Mississippi that have said, this change to entry requirements has given me a chance. So there are potential ramifications for the diversity, for having better diversity in our teacher pipeline. And so what that kind of brings me back to is in December 2021, are we really going to go back to what requirements were in the first place for EPPs or for licensure, or does this open up another opportunity for some flexibility of maybe we don't have to be held to a certain score on the praxis. So I'm just interested in your thoughts of if you think maybe EPPs are going to consider flexibility going forward, or maybe does it become business as usual once this is all over?
You know, from a policy perspective, that's a really great question. And it's not, the thing is that it's not just going to have to be the EPPs, right? I mean, to me, this is an opportunity for us to link chief state school officers, superintendents, principals, and teachers and really talk about, you know, what we can do to do this differently. You know, we want innovation. We want our teachers to be innovative. As a country, we don't give our teachers enough time to have that kind of innovative thinking. We don't give our faculty and EPP programs enough time. They're busy making sure they're meeting a set of state requirements, right? They're making sure their teacher candidates are going to meet whatever it is that they said are required to get into a classroom. I would like to think that if we could come together around things we could agree on, as opposed to always talk about things we disagree on, but it's going to take all of us. It's going to take everyone really collaborating with one another and seeing this as an opportunity, because the tendency for a system to go back to the way it was is really high. It's just, that's systems theory, right? Whatever crisis is over with, now we're going to revert back. I would say we don't revert back. I think we really need to think about how we diversify the profession, what we mean when we say a classroom-ready teacher, what those pathways are that bring people into teaching, and to get everyone agreeing on that and wanting to really help all of our kids versus pointing fingers at one another and playing the blame game. There hasn't been a field that I've been in that points fingers at each other so much, and we've got to stop.
And that's really very well said. And one thing I'll add is, or two things. One, I think a change that probably will persist is different ways of organizing clinical experiences, both the field experiences and student teaching, because school is not going to look like it has next year. It may not look the year after. It's going to depend a lot on when there's a vaccine and when there's treatments. And so I think that different configurations of sort of practice-based learning for future teachers, field experiences, clinical experiences, that's going to change the policies around those, which have dramatically sort of created new flexibilities in the last 2 months, are probably going to have to persist in terms of their flexibilities. And so then the question will be, how do you also include some accountability that doesn't allow all the flexibilities, again, to lead to greater inequity, and what that looks like. But I think there's going to be a shift there. I'm not sure what's going to happen on the entry and exit assessments. I think I think Pearson and ETS have a strong opinion on that matter. I think that there's always the question of the state responsibility to communicate to the public about, you know, efforts taken to ensure teacher readiness. And so what I'd like to see in the next year or so, as there's this flux, is let's introduce some other ways of measuring teacher readiness or thinking about teacher readiness, some other indicators of teacher readiness that perhaps are less biased. And let's then collect the information and have states and researchers work together to collect the information to truly know what are better sort of indicators of teacher readiness if it's not those content exams in particular. So we'll see what happens, but I'm hopeful that there may be some better paths forward on that.
And, you know, I just want to say another quick point. I think we need to not just focus on the individual teacher. I know that that's what this conversation is about today. It's about licensing teachers, making sure they're certified. But I really do think, in answer to your question, Bracy, we need to look at the entire system and what the system perpetuates and how we can start to change that. It's not just the individual teacher. It's the local community, it's the zip code, it's the access to resources. I mean, there's a whole host of things that I would like to think we can take a different look at.
All right, y'all. Well, I'm back, and I have some audience questions here. The first one we have is from Rebecca Koenig, who is a reporter at EdSurge. Her question is, have schools of education or teacher prep programs traditionally trained students how to teach remotely or train them in online education? Or up until now, has it all been classroom-based teacher prep? And are any schools of higher ed now planning to add remote instruction or online ed to their curriculum?
There is a strong community of educators inside of teacher prep programs that are dedicated to making sure that each teacher candidate has that technological literacy. Do they have it? No. I do think that this pandemic is really showing how much that's needed. You know, there are a couple of places that do this very well, and one place I would say would be the University of Central Florida. You could look at that program in terms of how they look and work with the Florida Virtual School. So there are some shining examples out there, but I'll just reiterate, I'll just give you a little anecdote, and I'm not going to say the institution, but it's an institution that predominantly teaches online. And I asked the question, so if you're predominantly teaching online, have you also then taught your teacher candidates how to do this well, since you do it so well? And the answer was no. So clearly there's an opportunity for us to learn some more about how to create that technological literacy. We're partnering with the International Society for Technology in Education, ISTE, on a COVID-19 coalition and leading the higher ed initiative to move this more into EPP.
So I have another question here. This one's from Daryl Gordon. He is at Adelphi University in New York. So he says he's part of an EPP at Adelphi near New York City, and they've been planning for the fall for student teachers and for students in fieldwork. And he asks, while we try to set up these plans, we understand that many schools are overwhelmed just with completing this semester. So do you have any suggestions for EPPs in planning fieldwork for the fall? I guess, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think you have to go into the fall assuming that candidates are going to be completing field work in remote settings. I think whether schools actually have their doors open in such a way that candidates can come in is just a big question mark. An example raised earlier of a state that has said no candidates will be in schools. I think it's just tremendously hard to plan. And I know every institution of higher ed they don't know whether they themselves are going to be remote or in person, and then they don't know if their school partners are going to be remote and in person. And most ed prep programs work with, somewhere between 10 and 30 different school districts, depending on, sometimes many more than that. So you have many different school partners. I think if you want to plan for something, and what we're seeing folks plan for where they can actually kind of organize is to plan for those experiences to be remote, and then finding those school districts that can that want the support and can make that happen. The remote tutoring idea that Lynn raised earlier, I think, is potentially a really promising way of thinking about how teacher candidates can both satisfy clinical experience requirements in terms of demonstrating that for licensure and for the state, while at the same time providing direct support to students and to groups of students. And would like to see high need districts in particular that form really strong partnerships with groups of educator preparation programs or single educator preparation programs to make that happen. We think there's a lot of potential in that and are seeing some places move in that direction.
I just want to give a shout out to Adelphi. They are an ACTE member, and also to say that I know that you're an institution that's been deeply impacted by the pandemic. What's happening on Long Island has been extraordinary. I know this because one of my good friends is a nurse on Long Island, and so kudos to you for continuing to plan, and I hope that everyone at your institution is doing as well as possible in a really, really challenging situation. I also want to point out something interesting, another anecdote. I was talking to a colleague of mine from Ohio, and this speaks to some of the challenge that we're going to be facing. A draft of Ohio guidance, right, for the upcoming year is that no visitors are allowed into the building. Is a teacher candidate considered a visitor? Right, so, you know, again, the layers of this are going to be very, very complicated.
Yeah. So Jenny Muniz, who is from New America, asks, in light of COVID, some states, for example, California, are moving to cut funding for teacher pathway programs, such as the Grow Your Own programs and scholarships. So I know I'm from Texas. We have a Grow Your Own program, and I believe that's where you get kind of high school students, right, kind of interested in teaching, and there's kind of a pathway from high school to college. Is that correct? Grow Your Own. Maybe if it's more than that, elaborate on that, just to clarify what Grow Your Own means for folks out in the audience. So how could this affect the teacher pipeline in the short and long term, these types of Grow Your Own programs and scholarship programs being cut in light of COVID budget cuts statewide?
Yeah, so Grow Your Own can sometimes refer to pathway programs from high school into post-secondary that includes a teacher license, also includes efforts by districts to partner with ed prep providers to get perhaps paraprofessionals or other non-licensed teaching roles that are individuals currently working in that district or in that school, and partnering with a provider to license those teachers. So generally, it's like whenever you have schools or districts working together with providers to drive preparation and license. I think it's a big question. You know, California has invested a lot in teacher residency programs, which in some ways is a form of Grow Your Own. And, you know, I think the future of some of those programs is in question, despite great investment and some really strong evidence from a number of teacher residency programs, both those that are directly run by districts as well as those that are run by colleges of education, oftentimes in partnership with districts. I know in California, I think some of the guidance has directed ed prep programs graduating candidates this spring to provide additional induction support to first-year teachers next year. But to my knowledge, that's an unfunded mandate, and prep programs are really wondering like how, when we are also, they want to obviously support their candidates that are graduating and provide induction support, but they're asking when they're already going to be experiencing budget cuts, both the privates and the publics, how they're going to make that work to provide, as I think the law has now mandated in California, that sort of induction. Again, going back to the Illinois example, would love to see states taking some of that CARES Act funding and putting it towards induction, because I just think this is a huge, huge need that systems are going to have.
Anna Hennessy asks, this is on the topic of licensing maybe career changers in light of mass furloughs, mass layoffs that are going on around the country in different sectors. Have you all heard of any resources specifically for educators or policies for those who've been teaching at the adjunct level, or those who have master's or PhD degrees, who would like to transition into K through 12 teaching? Is there kind of any fast track programs for folks like that you've heard of?
Go ahead.
Well, I haven't heard. I haven't heard of a lot, and I think it's. I'd like to see some.
I mean, they do exist.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think the question is whether or not their existence is known by people who want to make those changes, and whether or not those individuals, given the high rate of unemployment, are going to have the resources to actually participate in those kinds of programs. But yes, most of the higher education institutions have a sort of fast track or master's programs that will allow for that career changer to move into the teaching profession.
So this question is coming from me, actually. So I'm curious, given our audience here at EWA is education reporters. I want to make sure that we talk about this reporting side, and I'm curious, and Bracy, feel free to answer this too, but where or what kind of data can reporters look to kind of predict or start to put together a picture of what the fall might look like for their local teacher workforce? It seems like certification and licensure is such a big, so many question marks, and how those questions get answered might have huge implications for what the workforce might look like in the fall. So where are some places that reporters can look, or data that they can turn to kind of get a sense of what their local school district might look like in the fall?
I mean, I would think to start that, starting with either the work of Deans for Impact or AACTE with regard to what the states are doing. And then in terms of digging down, I think the best people to talk to are your local superintendents. I mean, I think that they would have the best sense of where to find the data, what they're thinking about. I would also, recommend that if it's possible to talk to both the local school district and the local education provider, right? The education program provider. I think you'd get some interesting data from both of those sources. And Peter may have other ideas.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I'd start with districts, and I think they don't know, because they don't know what configuration a school will look like, and they also don't know how teachers are going to respond to those configurations in terms of, returning or not returning. Lots of questions around planned retirements, early retirements. A lot of teachers are just exhausted, or we're all exhausted right now. Teachers are really exhausted right now, and I think there's big questions. And there's big questions if you're a teacher with school-age children, obviously yourself, and what's their childcare going to look like. So districts and superintendents are going to be figuring this all out over the next couple of months, and I think as a reporter, really trying to understand how their thinking is evolving, what they're hearing from their teachers is going to be important, because there's virtually no way to actually predict at this moment on May 15th what the configuration of school is going to look like, and then what staffing is going to look like.
Bracy, do you have any advice, having reported on written stories on teacher certification yourself? Any advice on sources or resources that you turn to?
Absolutely. I would say reporters should familiarize themselves with their state's certification guides, just to see basically what does the state require, because it does differ. I would also say that it's worthwhile going back to the data question to see if you can get data kind of depending on whether you're a state reporter or local or regional, what have you, of what were the vacancies that were in place prior to COVID-19. I think it's a really good idea, if you can, to get enough for going back at least 3 years, if that's possible, so you can kind of see what the trend has been for teacher turnover in districts and in the best of times, so you maybe know what sort of obstacle is ahead. And then to just back up Lynn and Peter, I think it's really worthwhile to just get in touch with your local superintendents and principals, and also your parents and students too. Unfortunately, we have a lot of kids in Mississippi. The baseline for them before all of this happened, I've talked to kids that had the experience of having long-term subs, where that could differ between that person basically just being a warm body in the room that was supervising them, to them being someone that actually did make an attempt to teach despite not having formal training. So I think those sort of talking to the folks that can give you that really sort of firm picture of what life was like before all of this happened, and then talking to the folks that will be doing the hiring during this time, to kind of wrap it up quickly. Super fascinated in what's going to happen in high needs areas that may have already had high turnover, or trouble attracting teacher candidates, rural areas that were already having population loss, and having trouble funding schools during this time. I think all of that can't be overlooked. by reporters as we kind of look at what the ramifications are going forward.
That's great advice. We are actually out of time, so I just want to thank you all again. And I know there were some audience questions we didn't get to. So Peter and Lynn and Bracy, your emails are on your websites or Twitter accounts. I imagine people can email you if they have any questions, or email us here at EWA. Thank you everyone in the audience for joining us. Remember, you're going to get a survey. Please fill it out. Thank you again to our panelists. This was a great conversation, really informative. So we'll be looking forward to what happens. Thank you. Thank you all. Have a great day.
You too.